This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover1 Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good morning and welcome to the Cover1 Buffalo Podcast. I'm not used to saying morning, but it's a fun, exciting time to be able to get together here. You are joining your normal host, Greg Thompson, and today I am joined by special guest Matthew Fairburn of The Athletic. Matthew, how we doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. It's an exciting time of year, and for anyone who hasn't checked it out yet, this is coming hot off the presses. The most recent piece coming out on The Athletic is a really exciting piece. We'll get into a little bit more here, but a prospect that some of you may know about, but many is maybe new to your understanding of draft prospects, and that's Kyle Duggar, and just an exciting piece that you put together here. I know it probably started out as a little bit of a hidden gem, and it seems that that's no longer the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's funny about the draft and just going through it from, the way I kind of attack it is you start to hear more things, as you go to the Senior Bowl and the Combine and things like that. And I knew who Kyle Duggar was because I went down to Mobile in the fall to do a story on Jim Nagy and, how he puts together the roster. And he had mentioned him, and I'd talked to some people about him, but I didn't really think about him for the Bills until I was at the Senior Bowl. There was a big contingent from Lenoir-Rhyne down there, and you just start to talk and, to scouts and things like that. And to hear how interested and how often the Bills were at Lenoir-Rhyne's campus, typically not, a huge indicator if it's, high-ranking scouts from the Bills going to Alabama or LSU or Florida. That's to be expected. But when they were the most frequent visitors to a small school like Lenoir-Rhyne, where there's one clear target. There's only one reason to go there. It piqued my interest, and I think it opens up a different conversation surrounding, those early picks, first and second round, a position that maybe people hadn't thought about, and that's probably more so why Bills fans, the name will be new to them, is because so many people are hyper-focused on receivers and edge rushers for good reason, but certainly not the only place the Bills have their eyes at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense. There's been a lot of different things out there. I just did trying to explain a little bit some of the things that were in place with the recent, conversation for the final league year and the CBA not being extended, up until the recent news in the past couple of days and the Schefter bombs that came out and having that progress there, that there was the potential we could see an extension reached maybe even in the next week, if not the next month. It sounds like that momentum is pretty legitimate. Being in that position, there were things there were different complicated facets of it that they put under a bucket of the final league year rules. And one of them was that 30% rule. I know you and, Joe talked about it on your show, some of the things that complicated having to tear up the final year of deals and having to, make sure that you increase salary so that future years didn't go up by 30%. I actually think that was a bigger hindrance to the Bills than what a lot of fans realized, and that it kind of penalized them with some bad timing of the discipline that Bean had, and now getting to the point that, hey, you drafted really well and need to extend these guys. Oh yeah, you don't get the benefit of that final cheap year of salary and, giving them a nice signing bonus and the future security of an extension, but you need to actually tear up that final cheap year. One hidden bonus of this is if they reach that extension, that's no longer in play. I'm curious, Jordan Poyer was probably the most likely candidate to be penalized by that rule before, that if, hey, we have to set aside a whole bunch of money here to extend these guys rather than just the signing bonus. Now I'm curious if that's in play. And I think your piece on Duggar really points out that maybe safety is a bigger need than what fans were initially thinking.
Yeah. My initial thought on, safety is probably more of a long-term need than people think. Micah Hyde is not, he's no longer young. He's 30, I believe now, or turning 30 soon. So his age kind of snuck up a little bit. And Poyer entering the final year of his deal, you don't know how those negotiations will go. I mean, he is rightfully so going to want a pretty big raise. They've gotten a nice bargain on him. But the thing about Kyle Duggar that's super interesting to me is basically since Sean McDermott arrived in Buffalo, I've been waiting or kind of wondering, who's going to be that Shaq Thompson, who's going to be that big nickel. And they used Raphael Bush there at one point. They've sort of sprinkled in Dean Marlowe there. Saran Neal kind of fits that mold, but they haven't found the perfect guy. And it's one of those things that they always mentioned. They're not going to do it just to do it. They need to have the player who's capable of doing it. Kyle Duggar, I think, is made to play that role. He's, a lot of people argue about, is this guy a safety or is he a linebacker? The beauty of the big nickel spot is that you want a player who you're arguing whether he's a safety or a linebacker. You want a guy who can, conceivably be both. And he showed down at the Senior Bowl that he can cover tight ends. He can cover backs. He played cornerback in college, and actually the coaching staff there had to convince him to move to safety because he fashioned himself as a bigger Jalen Ramsey type corner. So he's so well versed in different roles on the defense that he should be able to pick up a position like that Buffalo nickel spot and really make it his own. And so if they were to invest an early round pick in Kyle Duggar, I wouldn't go as far as to say it means the end of Jordan Poyer. It could be a situation where he plays a little bit of that nickel role and then they move on from Poyer and, move Duggar over to safety. But it could be as simple as they like this guy as a big nickel. I mean, they like having those versatile chess piece type of guys. And he's 100% that. He's a guy who can make an impact on the defense right away. And, he would basically fill, two needs. You could argue nickel cornerback's a need. They haven't gotten the best play there from Saran Neal and Taron Johnson. Taron Johnson has had his moments. I like him as a player, but he gets hurt a lot. And, now they need a strong side linebacker in Lorenzo Alexander. Well, maybe you kill two birds with one stone and take a guy like Duggar and, he can fill a few different roles for you. So I don't think he's a guy that you necessarily pigeonhole into one spot. But all of the things he has that line up with what the Bills like are almost too much to ignore, right? In terms of who he is as a person, how highly motivated he is, the nastiness he plays with on the field, the rare athletic traits that they're always looking for. He reminds me a bit in terms of personality of a guy like Tremaine Edmonds, and also has that, those rare physical gifts as well. I think next week is going to be anybody who hasn't heard of Kyle Duggar before next week will hear about him after how he tests in terms of 40-yard dash, vertical leap, all that stuff. He moves extremely well for his size.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were kind of joking in the prep for the show that, a lot of people listening to this, if you're not tapped into that, draft prospect world, this could literally be the first time you're hearing this guy's name. And if you hear, why are they talking about a D2 safety as a player that could be filling these roles? Just an FYI, he's going to show up at the combine, probably be a little bit taller than Matt Milano, weigh about the same, and instead of the 4.67 40 that Milano ran, he might run a 4.39. And just to have that combination to be the size of Matt Milano, and I know you wrote about it in your piece that he's probably going to weigh in around 220, 224, but as the frame, the guy said the broad shoulders, and some of his coaches and Nagy commented that he could easily end up being 230 plus from the way that he's built. That's exactly where Matt Milano is now, except he might run a 4.3 40, and having that kind of explosiveness is just off the charts to have that kind of versatile weapon. And you mentioned Lorenzo Alexander, and his versatility was forward with also being able to go down as a pass rusher. Maybe the versatility is backwards in that it's first and second down is as that strong side linebacker, and then he can play the big nickel, and he can also probably fill in that special teams maven role that Lorenzo Alexander had. It's rare to have somebody that can check that many boxes, and it's understandable why he's skyrocketing up some draft boards, or probably not draft boards. He's probably been there the whole time. We're just now finding out about it as the football public.
Well, he is one of those guys where, you hear the term skyrocketing up boards all the time. And like you said, usually that's the outside world catching up to the NFL world. But in this case, it is sort of a case of a guy skyrocketing up draft boards, because you first see a guy like this if you're a scout and you think, okay, he's playing D2. I have to put a conservative grade on him. He's got to be day 3 because, his physical traits are amazing and he's dominating at this level, but that's really hard to project. Until you see him at the Senior Bowl, that's when you can feel more comfortable putting that day 2 grade on him. And then if you're, in a spot where you see him run in the 4.3 range, like you're talking about, all of a sudden, maybe there's a team that can talk themselves into it at the end of the first round because they don't think they can wait until the end of the second round. And you mentioned special teams. The other amazing part about this guy, and we'll see if it translates to the NFL, he's a really, really good punt returner. Like scary good punt returner. You don't see too many 220-pound punt returners, but it was D2, but man, he knows what he's doing with the ball in his hands. So not only was he their dog on kickoff coverage, he was, the guy sometimes bailing them out and creating offense. There was a game, Drew Cronick, they're now coaching at Mercer, coached him last year, the last 2 years, was talking about a game where they were down to their 4th string quarterback and Duggar returned 2 punts for touchdowns, basically single-handedly won them the game. It's like, that's the type of guy that you need to see at D2 to feel comfortable spending a 1st or 2nd round pick. And, people, like you said, kind of look sideways at a D2 player, but look around the league. There's a lot of really good Division II players. Matthew Judon played Division II. I mean, there's a pretty long list of successful D2 players, but it's been since 1999 since one went in the 1st round. For whatever reason, in the last 20 years, teams have been hesitant to pull the trigger in that way, but there have been a lot of guys who have, provided good value because, if you can play, they're going to find you. And sometimes you fall through the cracks as a recruit and, it's an inexact science. Not a lot of guys go wire to wire D2. A lot of guys transfer out, but it'd be a pretty cool story if he ends up sneaking into the 1st round.
Yeah, it's really funny. We just got a comment in the chat area here on Alomar. I actually had paperwork logged to go to Hobart at one point. So I was actually very aware of Alomar as he was coming up. But I think his transition and the enormous contract that he earned, I think those are reassuring things. I think Matthew Judon's about to get $60 to $80 million from someone, showing that you can make that investment and that it can work out. Might give someone the courage to pull that trigger and want that 5th year, option on someone like him. And, selfishly, I hope that's not the case. I'd love for him to be available at the 54th pick for the Bills. But, if he shows out the way that it's possible here, it could be an opportunity for, them to really, not have any alternative but to go that direction.
I know it's a pick that probably won't be popular, one that, people will need to talk themselves into over the next couple of months, but he's a name to definitely keep in mind because there are teams at the end of the 1st round who really like this kid. And I don't know if, they're at the point where they would pull the trigger, but the thing about him is he's so clean. The only thing you poke a hole in is the fact that he played D2. The only other thing you could maybe, kind of raise eyebrows at is the fact that he's a little bit older. He did play 6 years. Didn't play 6 seasons, but he's been in college since 2014. So he's a little bit older than you would prefer, but he's not, an old man by any means. There's plenty of guys that are going to go in the 1st round that are his age. And those are things that, those are minor things. At that point, you're just nitpicking. You're looking for a reason not to pick him. If this guy went to Mississippi State, nobody would have a problem with him in the 1st round. And I recognize that level of competition is real and that adjustment is real, but I think he showed at the Senior Bowl that he's more than capable of that. So he's the type of guy that I think would really fill an understated need for them on defense and provide them kind of an impact guy. They've, been very adamant since they got here. And, Brandon Beane's always, joking with us, like, you guys didn't believe me, but we go best player. You guys never believed me, but we're going to pick the best player. And that means that they're not going to force a wide receiver if they don't have to. They're not going to force a defensive end if they don't have to. And if this guy grades out the way I would expect him to, then he'll be in the conversation there because it will be hard to sit there and say, can we wait till 54? It's not an easy conversation to have in the draft room. And when a guy checks so many boxes like this guy does, somebody's going to talk themselves into him, and it won't be very hard to do.
Yeah, I didn't plan on the whole podcast being about Kyle Duggar, but it's interesting when any fan who's listening now and has gone on the Draft Network or FanSpeak or any of these mock draft machines, you know the scenario that I'm about to describe here. If we go through those first 21 picks and we don't have AJ Epinesa or Clavon Chason or Henry Ruggs or Jerry Jeudy or CeeDee Lamb or one of those obvious picks fall to us, you get into a space, or say Laviska Shenault goes in the top 21 picks, say Yetur Gross-Matos goes in the top 21 picks, and all of a sudden the 6, 7, 8 names that you see thrown around so often, what if those guys go in the top 21 picks and that those happen to be the areas that are there? I think you get into a space where they're looking at best player available, and that could open up things like a cornerback like Christian Fulton. That could open up things like a Kyle Duggar. It could open things up like an offensive tackle that I don't think a lot of fans are thinking about being a priority today, but there could be a scenario where that's genuinely the number one option on the board at the moment. And like you said, they've shown that that's going to be where their preference is. And I think that kind of takes us into my questions on you preparing for the combine. Obviously, doing your homework on a player like this for your story makes sense. When you're going down to Indy, one, is it based on, hey, you're going to have a great opportunity to talk to pretty much every decision maker in the NFL in one spot? Is it more prospect focused? Do you do more homework on one set of positions? Obviously, probably a little deeper on defensive end or wide receiver, if that's logical for the Bills, or do you kind of let the performance speak for itself, that if you have a DK Metcalf blow up, that's going to be where the story takes you? Give the fans a little bit of insight on what's your prep for an event like this.
Yeah, so it's changed a bit over the years. So most people probably don't know, before I covered the Bills, I covered the draft for SB Nation as a whole. So back when I was doing that, certainly it was more prospect focused, storylines of certain players, and, all the players are available to the media there as well. So that's a good opportunity to get some face time and, sort of lay the groundwork for stories. As I've, especially now at The Athletic, we have Dane Brugler as our draft guy. I don't really need to be necessarily telling people who the best offensive tackles are or what a certain performance means or anything like that, because I can point to Dane Brugler. He's the closest thing, he does the job like an NFL scout. He's been offered, jobs, I believe, to be an NFL scout at times or to work in that capacity. So he knows how it's done, and he, I think, is, as good as it gets in that regard. So that frees me up to, certainly focus on the Bills angles, right? Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane will talk. Like you mentioned, all the important decision makers are down there. There's a ton of agents down there. So it's actually all the agents have to be down there for a meeting. And so it's actually a good time to start thinking about free agency. In terms of on-field performances at the Combine, I don't need to relay a lot of that to people, because the weird thing about it is, you mentioned DK Metcalf blowing up, right? He's going to be available. A guy like that will be available to the media before he does his drills. And so even when he blows up, you're not really talking to him about how he blew up. You're talking to, it's such a quick news cycle. People can watch on TV.
Yeah.
So I try to, and this is what I try to do, honestly, every day, even when I'm at the Bills facility or when I'm at, wherever I am, it's what I'm here and, somebody else isn't. So, my reader isn't here. How can I make them feel like they're here and show them something that they can't, see on TV or, get from a video clip on Twitter, or even sometimes that is the, for like the Senior Bowl, for instance, that is the sort of the taking somebody behind the curtain, is like, here's a video of practice and somebody's not at practice. So anytime I can, get something that nobody else is going to have, or that is going to take readers someplace that they couldn't otherwise go, take advantage of the fact that I'm there and that, I can talk to people, like you said, and you just hear a lot of things. Sometimes it's more productive for things that you don't write that week. It's actually, as far as news goes, not the newsiest week in terms of content, right? Of turning out daily content. it's good for laying the groundwork for what's to come in the next few months of, getting a feel for the landscape of the draft class, getting a real feel for the landscape of free agency, which guys are going to hit the market, which guys won't. And just overall networking with scouts and front office people, coaches that are down there, agents that are down there. It's a really productive week from that standpoint. And a lot of times maybe people don't see it that week, but a lot of the stories you'll see between now and the draft, the groundwork was laid down there. So sometimes it is, like you said, a certain position, right? Maybe there's some offensive tackles that are of interest, or a few wide receivers that I didn't get at the Senior Bowl that people might like to hear from. But a lot of times those guys are speaking at a podium and that's on TV. And, again, try to go somewhere that everybody else isn't to give people something that they can't get anywhere else.
No, that's a perfect segue into a question that I had prepped you for that is honestly the closest I've ever been to true professional jealousy. When you got to do your scouting trip with, the leadership and being in Joe, I believe it was being in Joe Shane.
Yep.
Going through there, tell the fans a little bit about that. It's a year ago, but still very relevant in having that kind of behind the scenes look about being able to see what it's really like when you have the top level leadership go to see those Big Ten programs and what they're looking for.
Yeah, that was an awesome experience. It was a really cool story to do. One I'd wanted to do, an idea I'd had for a number of years. Doug Whaley wasn't interested in it. And Doug Whaley, and there was an old PR staff that wasn't super interested in it, when I brought it up. And not super surprising that they weren't. But last year, new PR staff, new general manager, I thought, maybe they're a little bit, more open to this. And it was actually, the season wasn't going great. And so you're kind of looking for different things to write. Everybody knew it was one of those years that was not going to go well, but that wasn't an indictment of the leadership in place, so it was.
Yeah, it's a nice luxury at the moment.
Right. You're kind of looking for, different things to keep you busy, because I don't want to say it was a wasted or a nothing year, because there was a rookie quarterback and people were interested in that, but people weren't super interested in the games each week. And so it was a Wednesday and I pitched it to the head PR guy, and I was thinking, down the road or whatever, hey, at some point, if he's open to it, who knows? Sometimes you do something like that and it's a year down the road and they say, hey, we want to circle back on that. We're interested. Well, they called me that afternoon and said, can you make it down to Oxford this weekend? And it was like, yeah, sure. So
yes, I can.
They were going to Ole Miss, South Carolina and Oxford, and then Alabama, LSU at night. So I flew down to Memphis on Friday night, drove to Oxford Saturday morning, dropped off my rental car and went the rest of the way with them. It was one of the weekends where they had access to a private plane. They don't always have that. So it's not the typical life of an NFL scout. When you're a GM and, your owner's willing to, invest the resources necessary, you can fly private once in a while. They don't always do that. And the typical area scout is driving a bunch of miles in their area. But
Road Warriors.
So we met at Vaught Hemingway Stadium in Oxford. I sat next to Brandon Beane and Joe Shane in the press box. And, from there we went, they had a car pick us up, and we took a private airplane from Oxford to Baton Rouge. Same thing, a car service to get to LSU, that was sort of the tough part about it, was getting in the building at LSU, getting a credential in time, because I found out on Wednesday that I was going to be able to do this. And as it is pretty much every year, LSU Alabama was the game of the century, right? It's like every year it's the biggest college football game ever. So they were kind enough to accommodate me. But it was sort of getting an idea of, I knew Brandon Beane was pulling a lot of these 2 games in one day type of thing. And occasionally he and Joe Shane would do it together. Not as common as you think. Brandon Beane was the only GM I saw all day. And those were 2 high-profile SEC games, and we didn't see another GM in either press box. So it wasn't, it's not the most common thing for him to log those kind of hours. I mean, they were at Mississippi State the few days before that, and flew over to Ole Miss the day before because they like to get in some practice. They learn a lot at practice, talking to coaches, talking to trainers, things like that. But it's a long week. I met them at probably 9 a.m. in Oxford on Saturday, and I think we landed in Buffalo at like 2 or 3 in the morning. And, of course, they're getting up and going to a game the next day. It was a home game against the Bears. So it's a long day. It's a lot of travel and work to put eyes on a prospect, which sometimes you think. My big question was, why do you need to be here? Why can't you just watch on tape? What are you looking for? What is it that is so important about being in Oxford, Mississippi that you couldn't get the next day flipping on the all 22 of this game? And a lot of it is what they do behind the scenes, at practice, the days leading up. I mean, think about that Ole Miss team. DK Metcalf was on that team. You're probably going to want to get the medical on a guy like that who had a neck injury. They did end up taking Dawson Knox. I think that was the only player from either game that they took. That was the funny thing. I pitched the story and I'm kind of like, I'll not say where we are. I could, write it in a way that nobody knows where we are and still get the point across. And Brandon Beane was like, you can say where we are. He's like, run it by me afterwards to make sure specific names necessarily aren't in there. But he's like,
Alabama and LSU isn't
right. Yeah. Well, good luck. I'm at Alabama, LSU. Who am I looking at? Good luck.
Which of the 30 players that are going to get drafted do you think they're in on?
Total on the day, we probably saw 40 plus guys that were either drafted or in camp, and probably a couple dozen more that will be drafted or in camp this year. So he was like, yeah, you can tell people where I am. Like a lot of times people know anyways. And a lot of times it's, okay, I need to get eyes on this guy and I'm going to be able to rule him out. They're looking at body types down on the field before the game. They're looking at how a guy, and, people who, listen to your show and follow your work know that they have a type that they look for in terms of personality. And you can pick up on a lot of that before the game, how he's interacting with teammates. Is he first in line in drills? Things that seem silly on the surface, but that can provide clues as you're going through the process. And so, a lot of interesting stuff as you see them they're on the field before the game doing all that. They leave in the third quarter because they got to beat traffic and get out of there and get to the next game or get home in the case of the late game. But, a lot of interesting stuff that they uncover behind the scenes, and it's a lot of work to end up with one guy.
Yeah.
They got Dawson Knox and they might not have, it could have been no guys, but you think about some of the guys that were out there, AJ Brown, Deebo Samuel, Brian Edwards in this draft.
Yeah.
You're still getting that baseline and covering a lot of ground. And Brandon Beane has said he prefers, if he's going to pick a guy in the first 3 or 4 rounds, either he or Joe Shane, he likes to have one of them had eyes on him live in a game. And the thing about it is, once you get to December and, you don't have those opportunities anymore to put live eyes on a guy. So you have to take advantage of it and put in the work while you have the chance.
Well, and you talked about it in your prep work or the other opportunities that come up at the combine. I would assume it's like that for them as well, that some of that may not pay dividends that day. Some of it may never come up. It may be that you got great insight on a player that you thought was going to be available in the third round and somebody else jumps on him in the second or whatever it might be. But you've now given yourself that intel. You've now given yourself that connection that, hey, it's getting up close here. This guy we thought he was going to be a first round guy. He's now available on day 2. That Friday morning, they're able to call back that coach and make that connection, be like, hey, I know we talked before. I just want to vet one more time. We're good on this guy. All the stories that have come out on X off-field concern, we're going to be clean with this guy going forward because you've now made that in-person connection and can have that follow-up discussion on them. And that legwork, like you said, maybe never pays off, or maybe it's this year. Like you said, maybe it's Brian Edwards or Patrick Queen off of LSU, or a player that they got eyes on last year and now they're able to see him this year. It's hard to be able to know the direct correlation of each of those visits. Right.
And, a lot of times I do get a kick out of, at the Senior Bowl or the Combine, Team X met with Player Y.
Makes me crazy.
It is an interesting exercise to say, okay, let's see how it matches up in April. But a lot of times they're looking at a guy to rule him out, or they're meeting with a guy to rule him out. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Sometimes they know that a lot of that stuff's going to get out there. And so, maybe they bring a guy in for a pre-draft visit as a smokescreen or as the final test to say, yeah, this isn't our type of guy. And the other thing too, and this is very big with this staff, maybe not all staffs, but they're very, prepared and very, meticulous in terms of their note gathering and the scouting system that they implemented when Brandon Beane got here. I'm talking not just like their grading scale, from a technology standpoint of, they're entering notes on Greg Little, when they're down at Ole Miss, South Carolina. They have a file on Greg Little. All the, anybody who's got like Microsoft Office knows they've got like OneNote or whatever it is that they use. They have some system that's used in there. So it syncs up. And so he's got the area scout notes already in there. And then Brandon Beane can write his notes in there and it automatically syncs up and he's cross-checking. And they keep that for maybe in 2 years, Greg Little's on the trading block at the deadline. Okay, what did that coach say about him when he was in college? Odds are not a whole lot has changed, but you can call, especially in Greg Little's case, because he's in Carolina, Brandon Beane could call Carolina and be like, all right, I remember this Ole Miss coach told me, this guy didn't work hard. Is that true? Has that been the case for you guys? And they talk so much about how free agency is an unknown in that regard. They don't have the guy in the building. They don't know that, what type of guy they are. They don't get to mold them the way they do a rookie. Well, if you have at least something to fall back on, some notes from before the draft, and we met with this guy at the Combine, and he was a real turd. Like, maybe he still is, or maybe he's changed. And that tells you who to avoid in free agency. That, it's all information, and it may not pay immediate dividends, but it's worth gathering because you don't want to be caught off guard by something, and you don't want to run out of time either. You don't want to be sitting there in April saying we need to bring this guy in for a pre-draft visit because we know nothing about him. You want to go into the process and go into those meetings with information. Hey, this coach said this about you. What do you think about that? Yeah. Or this coach said that you were late for, weightlifting sessions routinely. Why was that? Maybe there was a misunderstanding, but you're armed with information that helps you get more information and ultimately make decisions.
And it sounds like both Beane and McDermott are never going to be accused of being unprepared for things. It's certainly everything that comes out is how meticulous, how detailed, how much information they gather. So like you said, you never know if it's going to pay off, but they're always going to be prepared in doing that. You talked about the transition of maybe using that information of free agency, and I think that's come up in a couple storylines here. One, over the past couple of days of missing out on Greg Olsen, where they had the previous connection in Carolina and knowing him and such a stand-up guy in the locker room. Another name came out this morning with Everson Griffin, who his first 4 years in the league were Leslie Frazier's 4 years as a head coach in Minnesota. So one, do you think that released veteran market is something they're going to play around in? A secondary question on that, do you think that the scenario of Greg Olsen was just checked all the right boxes of that short-term investment, a guy that they knew, an NFL Man of the Year winner, and just couldn't be turned down? Or is that more of an indication of a need at tight end and what they might see going into this offseason of free agency?
Yeah, I don't think they're, in desperate need of a tight end by any means, but I also don't think it's a position that they're going to overlook. And Greg Olsen was certainly a unique case, right? A guy that they, knew really well, knew would be that leader that they want. They like having one of those guys in every position room, but they could also kick the tires on somebody else. That, Tyler Kroft has a contract that's pretty easy to get out of. Yeah. Not saying that they should automatically do it, because I do think there's probably something there with Tyler Kroft. He's a guy that teammates really got along with and, had sort of a quiet, understated leadership role last year. But if you kick around and you say, oh, well, like with Greg Olsen, well, here's an upgrade and we can, move on from Tyler Kroft. I think that's something they're always going to look at. And I do think tight end is, one of those positions. Look, everybody talks about the need for a receiver, which is real. They definitely need one. They need pass catchers. They need playmakers. Yeah. They need guys that can, make an impact on the passing game. And you don't want to ignore tight end, because, we got Dawson Knox and this and that. Yeah, Dawson Knox is good, but there's room for 2 tight ends on the field. Brian Daboll's, made use of that in the past. So they're never going to want to, be in a place where they're desperate for something. Probably the only time I've seen them really be desperate is when they, needed a quarterback in 2018, and it was obvious, and they moved heaven and earth to do it. They didn't get, raked over the coals or anything, but they weren't dealing from a position of strength either. Yeah. People knew they really needed a quarterback. They try not to operate that way, and that's why you see them in that veteran free agent market, because if you can add a guy before free agency, that helps you out. It helps you be in a spot where, okay, yeah, it'd be great if we can get, X defensive end at this value, but we already got Everson Griffin, so we don't have to feel like we're in a position where, we're desperate. So I think, a guy like Griffin would make some sense. I feel like any time a veteran who is one of those guys, like a Greg Olsen, or a guy that they know, and a guy that is, of a certain makeup, character-wise and leadership-wise, it's always something they're going to explore, because it's a bit of a market inefficiency in some ways. The earlier you can get those guys in, the more heading into free agency and the draft. And it doesn't always work out, like Vontae Davis, but it's, something that they're always going to explore, because you can, get some guys. Look at Spencer Long, great example. They make that move. They didn't feel, okay, we got Spencer Long, we're set. They thought, all right, we got Spencer Long, let's add some more competition. Already got one guy in the door, but let's keep adding to it. And that gives them a lot of flexibility. So you're right to have your ears perk up when you see a veteran get cut and, think the Bills are going to kick the tires, because they do wisely look at that, and it's a good chance to get some value.
Yeah, they've obviously shown a history of some of those, and I know not the released portion, but a pending free agent I think is very similar to Griffin is Mario Addison coming out of there, and you have the connectivity, not only Eric Washington coming over as the D-line coach, they're actually both Grambling alums and have a close relationship there. That's an area where either, and some fans bring this up, last year the opposite was true in my perception of Devin Funchess, and that, hey, that was a draft pick of that class. Well, he sat out there for a long time with no offers, waiting for anyone to be able to dangle anything for him. And Bean and McDermott never even brought him in for a visit. So sometimes history can tell you why not to pursue a guy and why he won't be a fit. But they also have obviously utilized that, and that people, I think, overplay the Carolina connection thing sometimes, but it's real. And they're going to use that history, whether that's any of their guys in their previous stops. Joe Shane has some history with some of the Dolphins free agents that are coming up this year. There's obviously some of the guys that might get cut loose in Minnesota with their cap problems. Leslie Frazier has some intel, and it would be silly not to utilize that to be able to make informed decisions.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the ones you don't know about, right? Joe Shane or Brandon Bean is super friendly with ex-coach. Okay, so maybe they didn't know this free agent really well, but they know enough people around him to make an informed decision. I think Mitch Morse is an example of that. They aren't going to invest that kind of money in the wrong kind of guy, and they want people to look at a guy like that and say, all right, this guy's making a lot of money, but he's not, slacking off or, not working hard. So, sometimes it's the obvious ones like Carolina, and sometimes it's not. And your point is spot on about it can be the reason you don't pursue a guy. Like maybe Josh Norman is that case of, people say, oh, he had his best years under Sean McDermott. Sure. But they also were perfectly okay with letting him walk, and you have to wonder why that is. So I think there's that aspect of it too, of not every guy that wore a Panther uniform is going to be in Buffalo, but certain ones can be a fit. The Panthers were a good team. They weren't lousy under, Sean McDermott and Ron Rivera and Brandon Beane and all those guys. They were pretty good. So sometimes that makes sense. I think Mario Addison is one almost too obvious, right? Because of the way he plays, because of, that veteran presence, the need at the position. Those are the types of guys that you look at and say, yeah, that they could, if they're going to spend money, look at Trent Murphy. I know, a lot of people aren't thrilled with Trent Murphy and the return he's brought, but that was a guy that you looked at and said, yeah, he's going to check the boxes off the field. He's going to check the boxes from a locker room leadership standpoint. And they're always going to be mindful of that, in particular with high draft picks and with, big money free agents. It doesn't mean they're going to be, not even looking at guys without, with, some small character issues. But in terms of the guys that are going to be the pillars on their salary cap and in their locker room, they are very mindful of the mental makeup. And so that's probably as important as anything when people comb through these free agent lists and do the research, is which guys fit from that standpoint, not just which guys fit from a talent standpoint.
Well, I use the example all the time. I think Trent Murphy and Starr are both perfect examples of what their version of mitigating risk is. I don't think anyone is going to make the case that either Starr Lotulelei or Trent Murphy are good values or are outproducing their contracts, because they're not by any reasonable spectrum of play. However, if your worst case scenario is that we invested in a player and they're a contributing NFL roster caliber player, that's a much greater return on investment than the risk of this guy is a complete bust. He's a liability on the field. We can't play him. And now he's a malcontent in the locker room, and we need to get out of that completely. That's a much different spectrum of risk. And what they do to minimize that, maybe they trade off a little bit on the upside. I would like to think they still take some risks to be able to get the bigger return. And you saw that Quentin Spain and Kevin Johnson far outproduced their contracts. But if they minimize that on the other side of it because they've vetted all those other pieces from a character standpoint, then if your worst case scenario is, hey, I get it, Starr's not a great value, but he's still pretty good. I get it that people are, it kills me. Everyone's, loving the idea of re-signing Shaq Lawson and bashing that Trent Murphy's a terrible value. Go look at their numbers. They're real similar between the two of them. They had very similar seasons. It's just funny that I think that shows the bottom end of it, that if you can manage it where that's your worst case scenario on a free agent signing, that really helps out the overall product.
Well, and there's also, look, when you sign guys in free agency, almost, the history and the numbers show that you're not always going to get, more often than not, that person's production is going to go down. Yeah. It's sort of part human nature, it's hard to get a guy to live up to a big free agent contract. I mean, I always think about Mario Williams. That guy did about everything he could do to live up to that contract, and still by the end, people thought he was a waste of money.
Yeah.
And he was producing 10 sack seasons.
Yeah, I think almost 40 sacks in 3 years, three All-Pro or Pro Bowl seasons, and most people recollect him as a bust.
Yeah, by the end of it, a lot of people wanted him out, rightfully so. By the end, but nobody was looking at it in the big picture of what that guy did. He was a beast, but when you sign for such a big dollar number, you're always tied to that, and that's in the locker room too. You're tied to that as a guy who says, you look at Ken Lucas in Carolina, got paid a bunch of money and was lousy and was no good in the locker room. And it created problems. There are tons of examples of that where guys get big money and, they kind of slack off, or, they get a little comfortable. They're not as hungry, or the fit isn't perfect. And you don't want that. And I think, Starr is an example of a guy that they certainly overpaid for. But they were in a position where they had the luxury of doing that. They were, they knew that by the time they really needed the money, they could get him off the books, no problem. And, that's where I think, they buy themselves a little bit of flexibility too. But it all goes back to why they love and prefer building through the draft, because those are guys that are homegrown, developed in-house. They know that the character and the personality is going to check out because they did all the homework in the draft, and they've had them in their, building for 4 and sometimes 5 years before signing them to that extension. And then, you're showing guys, new draft picks that come in that, hey, if you put in the work, this is what happens. We take care of our own. And that, really breeds a nice culture in the locker room. So they're getting to the point in this rebuild and this build now, I guess you would call it, because it's year 4, that they're probably not going to lean as heavily on free agency. And they do want to take care of their own and use the draft and all that. And yeah, they've shown that they're pretty good at finding value plays in free agency. And that's a nice skill to have, because, when you can find the Micah Hydes and the Jordan Poyers who return way more than you paid for, then, it's a good position to be in. It's a good way to plug holes. But it's not ever going to be the base of Brandon Beane's roster building strategy.
Well, and like you said, that reward of the guys who put in the work is a perfect way to kind of segue into our final segment here. Let's do a little bit of kind of a rapid fire. We got 6 names of real free agents that I think are out there, of either current to re-sign or of extending guys. So I'll throw some names at you. Let me know your thoughts of either whether we're going to bring them back if they're a free agent, like the first couple, and then I'll throw a couple of the extensions at the end of whether you think we'll see a extension here between now and the season, let's say, and let's use the assumption that the new CBA extension is reached and it gives Beane the flexibility he would have planned on. So let's start out with an easier one. What are your thoughts on Kevin Johnson coming back to compete with Levi Wallace?
I think there's a pretty good shot of that. They liked what they saw from him last year. He really liked being in Buffalo. And, enjoyed the coaching and all of that. So I think there's a real shot of that one. I actually think he's he's going to be the guy that gets more looks outside and might be tempted to test free agency, maybe more so than people think. I think a lot of people are thinking, Shaq Lawson and Jordan Phillips are the Bills' big ticket free agents that other teams are going to be attacking. But Kevin Johnson is going to be higher on that list than people think. So I'd say there's a definite shot that he's back, and I think they should make an effort to bring him back. But he might be tempted to see what's out there, because I think some teams are going to be interested.
Well, and he's the highest draft pedogree of any of the guys that were out there. He obviously, I think he played some crazy number, like 23 games in those 4 seasons with Houston, but he played all 16 here with us and played 100% of the snaps in the playoff game. So it certainly showed that it's in his range of capability to stay healthy.
Absolutely. 100%.
Jumping into the next one, how about Quinton Spain? I know a lot of people throw out the idea of, I think people talk about the idea of moving people's positions on the offensive line a lot more frequently than what you actually see it done. Everybody likes the idea of, just move Cody Ford. You talked about Spencer Long. We have John Feliciano. There is some depth there and some options not to have to, but he certainly brought a lot of consistency next to Dean Dawkins. What are your thoughts on whether we'll see Quinton Spain back?
Yeah, after the season, I thought there was a pretty strong chance. I've cooled on that a little bit. He's one, I'll be interested to poke around on next week and kind of figure out where things stand. He's another one that probably wants his chance to test the market, given that, he didn't really get much interest last year when he did hit the market, and maybe a spot where they do feel comfortable. They have some depth. And I do think there might be a chance, and I'm with you on, it's one of my I don't want to say pet peeve, but I do sometimes laugh when people say, oh, just move this guy here. It was always a big thing with Cyrus Kwanjo. Oh, just move him in here, move him to guard or whatever. And it usually takes teams longer than it takes, fans to get to that point. I do think there's a shot that happens with Cody Ford if the right offense. This is such a good offensive tackle class that I think it might be a spot where they look at in the first couple of rounds to get one of those, big name prospects. And if they do, that presents a perfect opportunity to, make Ford a guard and, go that route. Maybe it's somewhere they look at in free agency. Look, the offensive line was good last year. It was not great. It looked really good because of how bad it was the year before. They made such a huge jump forward, but they were still below average in most categories. So
historically terrible to average looks really good.
Exactly. That was they were crawling out of a deep hole that 2018 dug. But I do think they can upgrade there, and I don't think they're done doing so. And so Quentin Spain might be a guy where, he wants to look at what's out there, and the Bills are comfortable doing that because they think they can find an upgrade.
I think that's spot on. I think there's a number where it makes sense where they just can't turn down the value, but I also think they're gonna have as much feelers out there for alternatives as what he is. I think that's kind of a 50-50 route. There's been a ton of discussion with Jordan Phillips and Shaq Lawson, so we won't spend a ton of time on that. Anything outside of the norm of I certainly think it's more likely Shaq is back than Jordan Phillips. I think Jordan Phillips, it's all about the value of what the number his agent and he see and whether anyone else offers that. I have always been all season long of the thought process that there is going to be a desperate GM and owner who want to sell that 9.5 sacks to their fans and are going to pay him as though that's sustainable and what he's going to produce next year. And if he does, God bless him. He earned that payday and I'll be happy for him. I don't expect that level of payday to be from the Bills.
Yeah, neither do I. I don't think they're going to break the bank for that guy. And I'm less and less convinced that anybody's going to. I think a lot of times, it's easy to look at a guy hitting free agency off of a big year and saying, "Oh, this guy's gonna get paid," but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's guys that you would think would get. I mean, remember Zach Brown a few years ago for the Bills? Yeah. A lot of people, man, career year hitting free agency, he's gonna blow up, and he didn't. And so I think when there's a gap between the value a team would put on a guy and the value that he wants to put on himself, that leads me to think that, he'll hit the market and maybe hang out on the market a little bit. Unless, like you said, all it takes is one team. It's what makes free agency contracts and values so tough to pin down, because all it takes is one team to say, yeah, we've got a ton of cap space. We have to spend it. Let's throw it at this guy who had a big year. And I don't see it making a tremendous amount of sense for the Bills to be that team, especially when they have in-house a guy that is going to take the majority of the snaps and, hopefully take a big step forward next year in Ed Oliver. I think they're ready to get him on the field more, and you can find a much cheaper rotational defensive tackle than Jordan Phillips.
Yeah, I'd thrown out Vernon Butler as another one of those Carolina connections. And that, again, I think we'll know pretty quickly Eric Washington will either give the thumbs up that, hey, yeah, we want this guy, or let's look elsewhere. So I think we'll know on a guy like him pretty quickly. But that's another possibility of, hey, I've always put it out there that I love what Brandon Beane did to find Jordan Phillips. You claimed him on waivers for nothing. You brought him back on a pretty cheap 1-year prove-it deal. He did well. Don't pay that guy. Go find me the next Jordan Phillips. Go find the next disgruntled, talented, misused guy in the wrong scheme that we can plug in cheap. Put him on a 1-year prove-it deal. Put him on a contract year that he wants to earn that big money, and then let him go do that. And that's how you keep those hungry guys who are really, really excited about their 25 to 30% of the snaps because they want to prove everything they can when they're on the field, not frustrated that they're not being able to live up to their contract or getting what they thought should be starting money when they're being brought in and now backing up at Oliver.
Yeah, I really like Jordan Phillips, the guy. Really enjoyed covering him. He was great to go to in the locker room, ton of fun, big personality, a good guy in the locker room. And I don't want to, paint the picture that I think this is a guy that will slack off when he gets the money. It's just, you want to pay for future production, not production in the past. And I do think in a lot of ways, his 9.5 sacks weren't, they weren't necessarily indicative of his level of play at times. He, was pretty fortunate in some situations. Sacks are sacks, but some of them he was pretty fortunate to clean up. And so I think it's best to let him test the market. And, like you said, hopefully for his sake, he gets what he's looking for because he deserves it. He's scratched and clawed for it. I just think the Bills, for the role that he would play, especially when Harrison Phillips is back, it's not necessarily worth paying that type of money.
Well, like you talked about, the information's out there. So the things you see on Twitter and that you can research, whether it's use SIS or you use Pro Football Reference or you use PFF or whatever people prefer for their advanced stats, his 2018 and his 2019 were very similar. If you look at his number of pressures, quarterback hits, and people measure those differently, one season he had 1 sack and one season he had 9.5, and every other isolated element were incredibly similar between the 2 years. NFL GMs and coaches see that too. So I think it's going to be interesting where that market ends up being. Let's transition into one final piece here. There are 4 guys I've kind of talked about as potential pillars on this team of the exact piece that Brandon Beane has talked about since day one. We want to draft well, we want to develop, and then we want to re-sign our own. There are 4 big pieces coming up here, 3 in that initial draft class and 1 in the real value that we showed in that first free agent class. How would you rank the likelihood of the 4 players being extended between Trey White, Matt Milano, Deion Dawkins, and Jordan Poyer? And how many of them, if any, do you think we'll see between now and the beginning of the season?
I think Matt Milano and Deion Dawkins probably top the list for me because they need to get it done. They'll probably want to get those done before the season starts because they're entering the final year of their deals. 2 guys that I would say, especially Milano, basically from the moment Milano walked in the building, he's been ascending, and I think he still is. So that's a guy that is going to command a pretty good contract, but you want to get it done sooner rather than later. You don't necessarily want him to go out and have an even better year and then have to franchise tag him or something else. Deion Dawkins plays an extremely important position, had a big-time bounce-back year this year, really important in the locker room, a guy that has become a leader almost surprisingly in some ways, worked through, the coaching staff called him out a little bit after his rookie year, or maybe it was after his second year. He had a good rookie year. So he's kind of worked through some stuff and become a guy that is a good example for them to look at and say, look, this guy wasn't perfect, but he did what we asked. He responded when we called him out, and, now he gets rewarded handsomely. Poyer is an interesting one. I'm, going to be interested to kind of kick the tires on that one because as a veteran, hasn't really gotten that huge contract and that he probably deserves the way that
he's outplayed his current deal significantly.
Big time. And I think he's got some good years in him. So I think they'll certainly want him back and they'll want to try to get something done. But is it going to be on his side? Is he going to be sitting there saying, man, I want to wait this out and, sniff around on what the market might look like. And who could blame him? Probably his last chance to get one of those big deals. And he's played at a level that would more than justify any team taking that chance. Previous White, certainly at some point they're going to get that done. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily a massive priority to do it. And I don't mean that to say they shouldn't extend him. I mean it to say you can wait. He's not entering the final year of his deal. They have the luxury of the 5th-year option. That's why you take a guy in the first round, is to have that 5th-year option and to have that leverage. He's not going anywhere. He's under team control for a long time. He's a good enough cornerback that You could use the 5th-year option, and you could use the franchise tag, assuming there's some version of the franchise tag in the new CBA, and have him under control for a while. So I don't think they need to feel a tremendous amount of pressure there. He's not going anywhere, and he doesn't have any leverage to go anywhere. And, you know, when he does, the only advantage to doing it sooner rather than later is you can set the market at the position, and in 3 years, it might be a bargain. You know, it might be, you'd be sitting there saying, Tre'Davious White would be like, man, the market now demands 17, 18 million a year, and I got this. So that's the advantage to doing it early. And, you know, the point you brought up with the new CBA is a good one, where they probably now have more flexibility in that regard. But I think Milano and Dawkins should be the priorities before White, simply from a timing standpoint of there's more of an impetus to get it done because there's only one more year of team control. And if you enter into that unknown spot after the season next year of hoping you can get a deal done in that time crunch, the closer a guy gets to free agency, the more he can taste the open market and the big dollars that get thrown around there. And the more they're going to want to say, maybe I'm going to try to get some of that. So getting those done soon would be, I think, a smart move and probably should be the priority. Those are two good players that they should want around for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, looking at some of the research that you can do. There are a handful, less than half, where they announce the 5th-year option along with an extension. For any Bills fans out there, there's no scenario where the Bills aren't exercising the 5th-year option. They get another year of Trey White between $11 and $12 million. That's a huge value compared to what they'd have to pay him overall. So there's no scenario where they don't exercise that. I do think it's interesting, and it's going to be a balance because obviously Trey White's representation knows the exact conversation we're having right now as well. There's kind of a dance between him, Marlon Humphrey, Marcus Lattimore, Jalen Ramsey, where they're all kind of dancing. They all ideally would like to be the 4th one to sign out of that 4 to each one up the next guy by the $500,000 or whatever it is to show that they got the highest rated deal. But there's also, you can sometimes wait too long and it's musical chairs and all that money's soaked up. So I'm curious to see. Yeah, I think there's a scenario where they announce the 5th-year option along with an extension, and I actually think that's in the Bills' best interest. I don't see a scenario where that's in Trey White's best interest and that he leverages more of that money long term. So I'm curious how that goes. I agree completely that Dawkins and Milano are the most logical, and I think we'll see them, especially now with this extension and not needing to tear that up. You get Dawkins last year at $985,000 and Matt Milano just over $2 million. Those are great values this year, but they get a nice big check now for a signing bonus and the future security of 3-4 years, whatever it is, tacked on at the end. And then if they do that, say they extend those two, and you have the 5th-year option of Trey White, it now opens up the opportunity for a potential franchise tag for Jordan Poyer. Say they don't get a Kyle Duggar, or they're still waiting on, is Jaquan Johnson the right guy? Do we have Saran Neal, or do we need to look at that market in the 2021 draft? All of a sudden, you're able to take a look at the idea of, do we want one more year? We still reward him. You're talking probably $12, $13, $14 million with that franchise tag number at safety, but maybe it's not the 3 years and $45 million that his representation wants, and we get one more year to kick that can down the road. I'm curious. Safety is a tough position. It doesn't drop off as quick as, say, cornerback does. You look at some of the best safeties. Eric Weddle played well into his late 30s. You know, Eric Berry is now coming back. You know, moving over. Earl Thomas made a huge impact. Kevin Byard. Tons of this good safeties that are being paid good money are in their early 30s in the NFL. That's not a precipitous cliff like you would see at running back and things like that. So I think there is a scenario where they do re-sign him, but like you said, he is one of those guys who hasn't seen that huge money. He isn't able to make a decision, maybe like an Everson Griffin could, where maybe the price tag isn't the number one priority, and the right fit and the right scheme and playing time matters. For him, this is his number one chance and only chance to cash in on a long-term deal. I'm curious if that comes from Buffalo, or if those other dominoes fall the way they are, they have that card to play and maybe reward him with a big one-year deal, but not the long-term commitment.
Yeah, it's also a position that they're good at developing and good at, getting the most out of, players that jump in there. So even if it's not Jaquan Johnson or whoever, they're pretty good at, they did it with Jordan Poyer, right? That was a guy that was, very undervalued in free agency the year he hit the market, and they got the most out of him. Not to say you want to gamble and find another one, but Sean McDermott and his staff are pretty good at developing defensive backs. It's all going to come down to what Jordan Poyer is willing to do. I know, a lot of these guys like playing on this team, and that helps to an extent. But like you're talking about, when a guy's sniffing the big payday, Jordan Poyer didn't grow up in Cheektowaga. He's a guy that's, not necessarily going to give a hometown discount, but I do think the earlier you get at some of these guys, the better chance you have. A lot of them, like feeling valued and like feeling, wanted. And the best way to do that, frankly, is with money. So they might they have to play the salary cap dance. And some of it will probably depend on what they're able to do in free agency. If they land certain big ticket, pieces that they're looking for, or if they don't spend as much and they have a big chunk of cash, maybe they say, all right, let's try to get Jordan Poyer back at the right number. Let's try to get all these guys done. The earlier you get, like you said, the earlier you get in the door, the less of a chance that price goes up because the market just keeps getting inflated, and the better idea you have of what your roster looks like.
Yeah,
the better planning. You don't have to sit there and say, do we need to take a safety because we don't know if we're going to have Jordan Poyer? The earlier you get it done, the better off. So it's going to be an interesting few weeks, trying to figure out where it's almost more interesting what they're going to do with their own guys than what they'll add, which is a different position to be in because it's been a while since they've had guys they even wanted to re-sign.
Yeah, it's exactly what they planned. And, I think that it's even happened quicker and more favorably than what anyone could have hoped for. But it's nice to finally have that kind of problem to be able to consider. So let's end on this note. I was going to ask you for a prospect to keep an eye out for, but I think your story this morning is a great indicator there. So I think one of the other questions I shot you for fans, maybe with an eye towards free agency, maybe on both ends of the spectrum, what's a storyline that you've seen gaining a lot of steam out there from a fan standpoint that you'd maybe tell Bills fans to temper expectations? And then I'll ask you afterwards, maybe one that's under the radar that maybe they should watch out for.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be a year where they're spending huge money on wide receiver. And I know some people have gotten their hopes up. I think the problem there is that the best guys aren't going to hit the market, and it's kind of a lousy free agent class after Amari Cooper and AJ Green. There's not a ton of guys that, are super exciting. I think about a DeMarcus Robinson as, maybe a guy that you get some value on, but I think the worry is because the free agent class isn't that great, some team's going to throw a bunch of money at him, and, that's where you get into trouble in free agency. And that's why it's so hard to predict is like, if Robbie Anderson or one of these guys is at the right number, then you feel pretty good. But if one team that has to hit, the floor is throwing a bunch of money around, they might not really care about the risks associated with some of these guys. So I think there's that. I think, like I mentioned earlier, offensive line is worth keeping an eye on. It's a good group of free agent offensive linemen on the interior. There's some good value there. I do like, Mario Addison makes some sense. I do think he's a guy that makes sense. I mentioned Marcus Golden in a piece I wrote last week as well. A guy that absolutely fits from a locker room standpoint, just a guy that's always hungry. And, we talk about if they lose Jordan Phillips, you might want to look at, some of these 3-techs that are available, veteran 3-techs that have a little something to prove, might be a little bit undervalued. So you're looking at those tier 2 and 3 free agents, maybe more so than the tier 1 free agents. The pie in the sky guy to me, and I know a ton of names get thrown around, but Matt Judon, who we brought up earlier. I mean, that guy, he's a beast, and he's somebody that I think would be worth, if the other, guys set the market at defensive end and he's a notch below, look at what Zadarius Smith did last year,
Perfect
leaving
comp.
Baltimore and going to Green Bay. Almost, changed the culture on the defense by himself. Had a huge year. And I've talked about this a little bit with Joe on our podcast and with some other people. Tim Graham and I have talked about this, off air. I feel like they need some mean guys, on both sides of the ball, guys that you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley, guys that you want on your side in a barroom brawl type of thing. And I don't mean to say that what they're doing, looking for good character guys, is wrong. And I think Rex Ryan probably took it to the extreme of, having a lot of guys that had, a screw loose, and it created a, combustible locker room situation. But a guy like Jerry Hughes is that guy, right?
A little bit of an edge, yeah.
He's a little nuts. And I think that's good, especially on defense. I mean, Tremaine Edmonds is an awesome player and probably going to become a great player. But you don't necessarily think of him as like a mean dude.
Yeah.
And a lot of the guys on defense are that way. And so I think a guy like Judon or somebody that has some of that nastiness to them is needed, both sides of the ball. I mean, you want those alpha dog type of guys. I mean, I think about Seattle and the way they built their team basically full of those guys. Yeah. It doesn't mean that they're bad character guys. It just means that they've got some attitude. Richard Sherman, Chancellor.
By all accounts, Cam Chancellor was a good human. He was just incredibly mean on the field.
Just a bad dude on the field. Like Doug Baldwin, great guy, absolute animal on the field. So they've got, not to say they don't have any of that. I just think it's something that a little bit of an ingredient that they could use a little bit more of to get to the next level on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, so I've been fanatical about Yannick Ngakoue all throughout the season. I've shelved that a little bit just because it sounds like they're going to try hard to franchise tag him. They need to cut like 6 starters to be able to do it, but whatever. Jacksonville's they made their bed. They have to lie in it now. So I'm assuming that he's not going to be readily available on the market. Judon's been a guy in that area, and whoever it is, the one area I love the philosophy of Brandon Beane. You don't splurge on these enormous signings. You grow your own. You re-sign your own. The one piece that I think really could be genuinely transformative is that game-wrecking pass rushing presence. I think the domino effect it could have on increasing the value of those last 2 years for Jerry Hughes, where he's not getting double-teamed, making it that we can maximize the progression and development of Ed Oliver because he's not able to be double-teamed. Having the back seven that we do, where you have those safeties, Trey White, the crazy range of Tremaine Edmonds and Matt Milano, all of a sudden everything takes just a little tick forward because we haven't had that. Where Jerry Hughes is your number one pass rushing option, you see what happens this year. He had a pretty good season, but it's not that hard to take him out of the game plan when he's your number one option, and his stats suffered from that. He still had the pressure and the overall efficiency impact that some people measure, but it's not the same thing. The domino effect it has if you're able to plug in whoever that is. I don't think it's Jadeveon Clowney. I don't know if Ngakoue gets available. I love the idea of Judon, especially if it's at 95% of the price tag of those guys. But plugging someone like that in, I think could have a really transformative impact on a really, really good defense into a potentially dominant defense that can win games single-handedly.
Yeah, it's really been the missing piece the entire time Sean McDermott's been here. And it's also one that, frankly, you're not going to really get after, say, the second round, right?
It's hard to get a pick 22.
Yeah, historically, it's just not easy because it's such a traits-based position. Yeah. You need certain traits from a height, weight, speed standpoint that not a lot of human beings have, quite frankly. And so picking at 22, you're going to have a hard time getting that guy. And so that's where, we mentioned at the top a guy like Kyle Duggar that people kind of think, man, I don't know. Or like, I think an offensive tackle is a real strong possibility at 22. And people think, oh, that doesn't make sense. They need an edge rusher or a receiver. Well, the way the market sets up, both in the draft and free agency, it's probably the better move to invest in a free agent pass rusher. just given how the draft class is at that spot. You look at where the draft is strong and you formulate your free agency plan based on that. There's a ton of offensive tackles. There's a ton of wide receivers. So, feel pretty good about, hanging out until the draft to get one of those guys. Whereas when you're looking for, an edge rusher, know that at 22, the guy might be gone, or you might have a different position higher on the board. And by 54, you're not feeling super great about what's out there. Okay, well, spend some money in free agency. Look at what they did last year. 3 tech looked like a spot where they had a chance to address it at the top of the draft, given the talent that was there. So they didn't do much in free agency there. They brought Jordan Phillips back on a cheap deal and got a little lucky that Ed Oliver was there and they were able to address that. So you have to kind of fit the puzzle piece together based on what the draft class looks like and what free agency looks like. And there's some damn good pass rushers that could hit the market. And if Judon's one of them, he's intriguing. And like you said, it has a real trickle-down effect and really changes the defense in a lot of ways. Think about how good they've been on defense without that. Yeah. Imagine if they had that missing piece, that edge rusher that could really ruin a game. It could certainly take this defense to a different level where they're creating, more big plays and changing a lot of games. And it could become an even more pressing need if Shaq Lawson isn't back. And they also have the flexibility of potentially, freeing up some money with Trent Murphy. There's always a way to free up more money. You talk about the Jaguars would seemingly be in a position to have no chance at bringing back Yannick Ngakoue, and yet you can work some cap magic, cut some guys, and make things work. You don't want to be in that position, but the Bills have plenty of money and the flexibility to free up even more money if they do decide to dip their toes into the deep end of the free agent pool.
Yeah, I've used Trent Murphy's example. The Bills have now moved past the point of making financial focused decisions. Brandon Beane took that medicine all at once. We ate that pill how we needed to. But that doesn't mean that he might not make the team from a football decision standpoint where the financials are a bonus. And I think the 2 names we threw out there are the guys who would threaten him. If we were to go after an Everson Griffin or a Mario Addison, all of a sudden the numbers match up really cleanly the same way that Greg Olsen and Tyler Kroft did, that, hey, we need to give Everson Griffin or Mario Addison $7, $8, $9 million. Hey, we can cut Trent Murphy free, bring that guy in, and now we feel like we made a slight upgrade at the same dollar figure. I don't want to equate Shaq Lawson to Ngakoue and Judon, but I almost think that's the path they're going to go in that, hey, we have a number with Shaq. We will bring him back at that number. If we decide to splurge, it's going to be instead of Shaq. I don't know that I see a scenario where they splurge on a Judon and re-sign Shaq. I think the money he's going to get leans towards a starter versus a rotational piece. But if they're not able to hit on one of those bigger deals, I do think bringing him back still makes sense. And then maybe you pair that with a guy he's such a great run defender, lacking a little on the pass rush side. A guy like Mario Addison or Everson Griffin could pair really well there to be able to kick Shaq down into the 3 tech next at Oliver in kind of a NASCAR formation and bring in a veteran who's at a lower price. I think one of those alternatives could be there where you don't automatically cut free Trent Murphy, but there could be a scenario where it ends up making sense football-wise.
Yeah, I think they're always going to be in a spot where they're looking at certain totals that they're spending on a position rather than, and they're going to hold themselves to that so that they're allocating the proper resources rather than spending, willy-nilly on every, guy and then being out of whack where they have way too much money tied up in one position and not enough in another. I think they're pretty mindful of that. So they'll play that dance a little bit where if it's looking like Shaq Lawson's going to be gone, that's money that it's not money that's currently on the books with Shaq Lawson, but it's money that they've maybe calculated that all of a sudden is available because he's not back.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. This has been a great talk. It's been a lot of fun, really leading into the combine, and hopefully you come back with some nice nuggets of information of the connections you make and maybe another prospect or two. Give the guys any ideas of things to watch out for that you might have coming up here in the future.
Yeah, you can follow all of our work at theathletic.com/Buffalo. All 3 of us will be down there, me, Tim, and Joe. We'll have some podcasts. We got a spot. The Athletics got a spot on Radio Row, so we might get some guests on our podcast and spice that up a little bit. I'll have a leftover notebook on things I'll be looking at the combine and various off-season thoughts, some of what we talked about here. And there'll be a few other fun features coming up down the road that I've started to lay the groundwork for, and excited to get down to Indy and dig into this class a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you very much here. Anybody listening now, you're probably already following Matt's awesome work here, but, at Matthew Fairburn on Twitter, everything going on over at the Athletic Buffalo and theathletic.com. Fantastic stuff. Again, check out the piece this morning. Really neat insight into Kyle Duggar. If he's someone that you're already aware of, it'll be a lot of fun. If he's not someone on your radar, it's a great name to now be able to get yourself familiar with. Thank you for the time today, Matthew. You've been listening to Cover1 Buffalo, and we are out.